Let's move on to our next speaker, Trevor Jones from astrobackyard.com, and he'll talk to us about deep sky astrophotography, proven methods for better images.
Hi, everyone. My name is Trevor Jones, and I am coming to you from St. Catharines, so just south of the lake from a lot of you in Toronto. And yeah, deep sky astrophotography is something that came into my life about just over 10 years ago now. And it really was life-changing. Unlike the previous speaker, my background wasn't in science, but art. I went to art school, and photography and visual art was a big part of my life and a big part of my career before I actually entered the world of astrophotography. So knowing that this is the RASC Toronto crowd, I'm assuming that a lot of you are shooting in light polluted skies, just like I am here in St. Catharines. So I'll try to focus on deep sky astrophotography, or deep space of nebulae and galaxies from a light polluted area, because astrophotography is a very broad subject that covers a lot of areas, but we'll focus on deep sky astrophotography through a telescope from the city. So just a little bit about me. Again, my name is Trevor Jones, and astrobackyard is kind of the brand that surrounds everything that I do. So astrobackyard.com is a website where I blog my adventures in the backyard photographing deep sky objects, tips and tutorials. And then I also have a YouTube channel where I share a lot of the content from my nights in the backyard shooting various deep sky objects. So the website and YouTube channel were started in 2015. As of 2019, it became my full-time job. And then I've done some really cool things. I was fortunate enough to be the instructor for Canadian Astrophotography School in 2019. And I even got my first NASA astronomy picture of the day last year. So it's been a wild ride, but this addictive, rewarding hobby of astrophotography is what has led me down this path. And I think that people that are, have sunk their teeth into astrophotography or even just getting started will quickly realize how addictive it is. And it really is, it can really change your life in a positive way. So I'm a die-hard astrophotographer, and I guess I would have to be to continue to be so passionate about photographing the night sky from the city with the weather that we have here in Southern Ontario. It's unpredictable, and it's obviously very cold in the winter, not very pleasant to be outside on some of those nights. But the toughest part really is, waiting for a clear night in the anticipation of your next deep sky project. So as I said, nebulae and galaxies, and even sometimes star clusters, deep sky objects are my passion. But I've also started to explore planetary photography as well, photographing planets. You can see the planet Saturn and Mars. That was nearing opposition last year. So there's so much to explore. Obviously, the night sky is just full of wonder, and it really is a hobby that can, expand and grow over time, and it's just endless. So I base my entire life and my schedule around a clear forecast, which we haven't had in a while. But it really is, there's a lot of sacrifice and commitment if you're going to go this hard into something as I do with astrophotography. So those pictures there, you can see my little refractor telescope on an equatorial tracking mount with a dedicated astronomy camera attached on the top there. And then below that is one of my larger telescopes, the largest, an 11-inch Celestron SCT. And so that's my planetary telescope. It has much longer focal length and magnification for objects like that. Now, I was asked to make sure that this was a little more intermediate to advanced in terms of the presentation format for this. So forgive me if I'm going too fast on some of these astrophotography terms and equipment, but I'll leave time for questions at the end, and hopefully you'll have a few of those. So my primary imaging location is, of course, the backyard. So I'm in the north end of St. Catharines. It's a Bortle scale class 7. It's actually gone up a class recently in the last 5 years with the introduction of the really bright LED street lamps that are, all the way down the street. So it's a very bright area. There's a shopping plaza close to me, and probably similar to a lot of the neighborhoods around the GTA. So you would think that St. Catharines would be a little darker, but I'm quite sure that my skies are similar to GTA skies. But that being said, I'm lucky enough to have good views to the north, east, and south, which is great for astrophotography in the way, the apparent rotation of the night sky goes. In the west, I do have a mature walnut tree, so objects tend to run into that eventually when I'm photographing them. You can see it without its leaves in the top picture there, but of course that really fills out in the summer. So my backyard bounty, these are some of the better images I've managed to take from my light polluted backyard. And, when I started this hobby, I really didn't think it was possible to take great deep sky images from the city, from a light polluted area. But over time, I've discovered that just isn't true. And it just takes the right approach, and you do have to work a little bit harder. Usually what I mean by working a little bit harder is soaking in more exposure time on a lot of these targets to overcome the drawbacks of a washed out city sky. So these are varying objects here. You can see the Whirlpool Galaxy, which is on the smaller side there in broadband RGB true color. The Bubble Nebula, which is quite a larger object, but we're kind of zoomed in there, and that was shot using narrowband filters. The Veil Nebula next to that was shot with a color camera and a multi-bandpass narrowband filter that kind of separates the important wavelengths of light that you want to collect for an image like that. And then the Trifid Nebula is, I surprised myself on that one. That is a broadband true color image with no filter using a DSLR camera from the city. So, you really have to work at it on the processing side of things to create an image like that from a light polluted area. But I just wanted to throw that in there so it is possible to take images like that. So I like to think of it as smart imaging. So a successful deep sky astrophoto is the result of planning, smart acquisition, and careful processing, as I mentioned. So when I say planning, I mean the right subject for your equipment, your imaging conditions, and the moon phase. It's not like I can say, okay, it's supposed to be clear on Friday. I've always wanted to shoot the Lagoon Nebula, so that's what I'm going to shoot. You really have to check to see if the type of object is a good fit for your equipment and your conditions in the moon phase before you start shooting. So it really limits what's available to you. The acquisition stage, the collecting of the pictures, it requires the right approach to the exposure lengths, the filtering that you use, and the timing, of course. Like I said, when and where is this object going to be? And then the image processing, the parts that are especially important when it comes to photographing deep sky objects from a light polluted area, the gradient extraction is huge. If you're lucky enough to photograph the night sky, whether it's wide angle, wide field through a telescope, or a lens from a dark area, on light polluted skies, it's so much easier to process because you're not spending half the time or 75% of the processing time just reducing that glow of the sky and creating contrast between the object you're photographing and the sky itself. Selective stretching is another key aspect of careful image processing. I'll get to that in detail in a minute. So here's an example image. I like to call it what went right. Because this image to me did go right. And actually I have a print of this on the wall opposite me right now. I was so happy with it. So what went right with this photo was that, so the target location for the time of year, this is the Seagull Nebula. So in February when this was shot, this object was rising in the southeast from my yard. And I was able to collect plenty of images on this target, enough to create an image with a healthy signal to noise ratio. and actually do it justice in the processing. If you're not familiar with the signal to noise ratio, all that refers to as the amount of signal or the light that your camera can collect versus the noise, which is just the artifacts and the result of a digital camera sensor through these long exposure photographs. So the signal to noise ratio is big, and you overcome that with more integration, more images. So this nebula also was a great choice to shoot using the filters that I did, which were hydrogen alpha, O3, and S2, sulfur and oxygen. So it's the right type of object for the filters I was using. The object was the right size for the telescope, the image scale, and the camera sensor. And it just turned out right because I did this planning beforehand. So this is an example of when everything comes together in the amazing images you can collect from the city. So before you start a new project, you need to ask yourself a few questions. Is it possible to image this object from the city successfully? Like I said, a Milky Way wide-angle photo or a faint reflection nebula, those are nearly impossible to shoot from a light-polluted sky. You need to travel somewhere dark to get those dim objects, and particularly in that blue spectrum of the reflection nebulae and the dim dust. That's very hard to do from the city. How much exposure time will I need to actually create an image that's worth processing? Does it need multiple nights of image collection, say 10 plus hours of integration for a strong image? And what can I actually collect from my backyard? That example you see on the right there of the Veil Nebula, that's actually the flying bat section of the Veil Nebula, Eastern Veil Nebula. That's a great example of what is a great choice from a light polluted backyard, because it is that supernova remnant that's just absolutely glowing in hydrogen alpha and the oxygen 3 wavelengths of the spectrum. Using a multi-band pass filter that isolates those 2 band passes, you can just capture a really striking high contrast image using a one-shot color camera, whether it's a dedicated astronomy camera like the QHY 268C used, or a DSLR mirrorless camera. So that's a great target to shoot from the city. You expect to get good results with that, as opposed to something like a reflection nebulae, which is much tougher from a light polluted area. So for the planning itself, I like to use I already heard someone bring it up, Stellarium. It sounds like it's a pretty household name for this crew. I use it all the time. It's so handy. And I use it for planning my projects. I look ahead months in advance to see where objects are going to be in the night sky, where the moon is going to be, and really helpful to actually load in a custom landscape of your actual backyard. So that's my actual backyard horizon you're seeing there, where my neighbor's garage is, where those cedars point through, so I can see when when the Lagoon Nebula is going to be hidden by a tree for 10 minutes. It's really handy for planning, and the process involves taking a panoramic image of your backyard and loading it into the software. And I can point in the right direction of a tutorial how to do that for anyone interested. And then there's the sensor view, which you can see on the top there, where you're actually plugging in the details of the size of your camera sensor and the focal length of your telescope to see the projected size of the deep sky object you wish to shoot. So that's really handy too for framing. You can get an idea of, okay, is my gear a good fit for this target? Is it going to be too small, too big? So Stellarium's a great tool to use for the planning stage. And lastly, in terms of planning, you need to see, okay, well, how long will this object be in my night sky before it hits, in my case, the walnut tree to the west? So can I get 3 hours of exposure time on it? Is it only 2 hours because it's so low? So that's why it's really handy to get in that custom landscape, because it may be available for 6 hours for some people and only 2 hours for you because you've got trees or other obstructions there. So that's really handy in the planning stage. As I brushed on earlier, multi-band pass filters, multi-band pass narrowband filters, they haven't been around for too long, but they've they've changed the game. I hate to use that cliche, but they really have. So if you're using one of these filters with a color camera, it will literally block out nearly all sources of light other than those specific band passes associated with the light that you want. So it's usually, a lot of these deep sky objects and nebulae have a strong hydrogen alpha signal. So we can isolate that, but on top of that, also a slight oxygen 3 signal too. That's glowing in a lot of these deep sky objects as well. So doing them both at the same time through a color camera has pretty astonishing results. Here's a couple example images shot with multi-bandpass narrowband filters. The Helix Nebula is one I'm particularly proud of because it was an iconic image of space I saw early on that I never thought I'd be able to photograph myself, especially from home. And that was using an Optolong L Extreme filter, just so a dual bandpass, O3HA. And then the Elephant's Trunk Nebula on the right was with a quad bandpass filter. This one is largely, again, hydrogen alpha and oxygen 3, but also a slight bandpass in H beta and S2 as well. Very subtle, but it gives you plenty of options and really fun data to play with in the image processing stages. So if you do want to shoot broadband images, which is just true color images in the broad spectrum of light without any of those harsh filters, it is possible, but you're going to want to shoot during the new moon phase and the weeks surrounding the new moon phase, just to give yourself the best chance possible. Also, if the object's higher in the sky and not low on the horizon close to the light dome, that will help as well. But really, the biggest thing when it comes to shooting these full color RGB images with a one-shot color camera or DSLR, it really comes down to the processing. You'll really have to work at it, and it's largely that gradient extraction stage of removing the light pollution from the image and just digging out those precious details underneath. If I'm working on a particular broadband true color project, I'll go to the lengths of renting an Airbnb at a dark sky location just to collect precious broadband data from a dark sky area, just even for one night to add to an existing project. So image processing itself is, quite magic when you look at the before and after of an image like this. Funny enough, for this image, it really wasn't even a clear night. There was a poor transparency, which you can see by the two bright stars in the processed image on the right. They're so fuzzy because they're just looking through a thin layer of clouds, essentially. But it's remarkable, the image lying underneath the light pollution, and how we can actually bring out the color and the details and the amazing structure hidden beneath a washed out city sky. So that is the Jellyfish Nebula in Auriga there. So image processing tools that you'd want to use, these are the ones that I use for registration, integration, and calibration. Very important. You're basically loading in all the images you've collected. I like to use Deep Sky Stacker. It's a free tool that still works great. The registration, you can think of it as just aligning all the images you've taken together and combining them. And then the calibration is using calibration files like dark frames and flat frames to help calibrate the image and produce a solid intermediate level file to process further. Sequator is another great free tool that works well. Adobe Photoshop is where I do the majority of my image processing, and that's largely due to personal taste. I've been using Adobe Photoshop for over 20 years, thanks to that photography and artistic background. Other people like to use PixInsight start to finish for their image processing, and it was designed specifically for astrophotography. So it has some really powerful specific tools that you can tap into for PixInsight. But the reality is a balanced approach between those two software tools is probably your best bet. There's some additional third-party tools. Topaz Labs Denoise AI is a powerful noise reduction tool that you'll want to use carefully. The Astronomy Tools Action Set is a plugin for Photoshop that I recommend. And then StarNet++ is it's a script essentially that removes the stars from your image. I like to say separates the stars from your image because most of the time you want to put them back. But to be able to process your image independently, the star layer and the nebula layer is oh so powerful when it comes to processing a deep sky image. So LRGB imaging, if you're not familiar with that term, you're shooting with a monochrome camera, black and white, through LRGB filters. So red, green, blue, and luminance, which is basically just the white light. So what I was surprised to find that from the city is that this approach, LRGB imaging from a light polluted sky, actually works really, really well. And it's because when you look at the spectral graph of those RGB filters, these happen to be the astronomic type, it really does isolate those areas of the spectrum where you're going to find those colors and cancels out a lot of the others that you don't. As opposed to if you shot unfiltered, of course, that wavelength is just capturing everything. So that isolation per color channel is enough to overcome light pollution in my case. And I highly recommend giving it a try. A lot of people think that you would have to shoot stacking a light pollution filter on top in front of these RGB filters, but it's not the case. So that image of the Whirlpool galaxy taken from my Boreal 7 backyard is a proof of that concept. So some tips for shooting in broadband RGB, true color images. If you can, like I just said, shoot with a monochrome camera. You're going to get a stronger signal than you will with one-shot color that's dividing that signal into those color buckets of an RGB filter. One-shot color unfiltered is possible, but you're really going to have to work at it in the processing. So, if your image processing skills aren't strong, I wouldn't recommend trying to dig out an image from an unfiltered shot from the city. Historically, I've always used these light pollution filters and swore by them, imaging from the backyard to just help separate the object from the sky. If you're looking for a mild broadband filter, like the Optilong L Pro is the one I continuously recommend and still use today after 3 years. It just does a great job. So as I mentioned, the challenges are those gradients and the color balancing. It's not uncommon to see, an orange wash over the entire image from the long exposure images of the night sky, of a light polluted sky. Often you'll see the image look very green, as you did a couple slides ago, just due to the sensor of that color camera. It's recording LRGB, so twice as much green. So you really have to adjust those colors and as I said, dig the image out sometimes. So there's a before and after of IC2118, I believe. It does have a name. I can't remember what it is right now, but that's, as you can see in the top image, it just wasn't even, I had to, just have blind faith that it was actually in there before I processed it and know that my mount star alignment was correct. But sure enough, it was there, and it took a long time to process out. So specific tools for removing those gradients. There's Gradient Exterminator, a great third-party tool for Photoshop. It does a great job. And then there's the even better automatic background extractor, which is one of the tools, processes in PixInsight. It does it better than anything else I've ever used. So PixInsight is something that takes a long time to learn. I'm still getting up to speed myself, but that was a real game changer, that automatic background extractor tool. And then using masks is something you're going to have to get used to if you want to start controlling the areas of the image you wish to manipulate and stretch, and the ones that you want to leave alone. An example would be, you want to sharpen an area of dust or clouds in your nebula. You certainly wouldn't want to sharpen black areas of space that may already be noisy. So just as an example. So narrowband imaging is really, advantageous from the city because you are blocking out so much of that unwanted light. In the example spectral graph there, that's the hydrogen alpha bandpass of 656 nanometers. And as you can see, you are really isolating that specific light. So in the case of Malot 15 here, you can see in that grayscale small image, that's just the hydrogen alpha there. And then to create that full color image, I shot it in O3 and S2 as well. So there's all these different color palettes that you can, display your images in to represent different gases. The SHO color palette, or the Hubble palette with those blues and golds is a fan favorite. I certainly love it. Lots of options for mixing the colors when you do isolate the gases and map them to specific colors like that. So H alpha, the great thing about when you are isolating a very narrow band passive light, the way I have with the H alpha there, you can do that on a moonlit night very successfully. You will need to shoot longer exposures though with these narrow band passes, because as you can imagine, you're really isolating the light you're collecting, so you need to expose longer on these often dim areas. So processing tips for narrowband, monochrome camera is almost a must, but it can be challenging in those narrow band passes to actually see your object in a single exposure because it is so faint. So I suggest shooting through that hydrogen alpha filter specifically. Usually that has the strongest signal, and then you can just switch filters and do your O3 and S2 in that same area once you've confirmed and framed things up using that H alpha filter. So just a little tip there. But it takes a lot of time. You need to build a full color image. You don't have that instant gratification that you do with a one-shot color camera that produces a full color image in one shot. But it's well worth the time and effort because you can create even more dynamic images. Balancing those channels of specific band passes of light carefully takes time too, because you'll find that some of the data is much stronger in certain signals than others. So you'll often have to pull that oxygen up, bring the hydrogen alpha down, stuff like that, to create a balanced image that showcases the object in the way that you want to, as is the case here with the Seagull Nebula. Some specific tools that are handy at this stage are the Correct Magenta Stars tool script in PixInsight, and then the SCNR green removal tool in PixInsight is another really powerful one. Just in case anyone's at that level and they're looking for some tips there, those specific tools are very handy. Here are my ninja processing tips. What I found is that if you blend your multi-band pass color data, so one-shot color camera and those multi-band pass filters, with your narrowband data, you can create these really fascinating images with a lot of depth. Like the image you see there of the Eagle Nebula with the pillars of creation highlighted. The more signal you collect and the more you can create separation between the light that's emitted in these objects, the more depth you're going to get, and the more you'll be able to control the variations of color and the gases in these nebula. So you create these one-of-a-kind images. There's a tool called deconvolution in PixInsight, which I avoided for so long, just the name scared me, to sharpen important structures of a nebula or galaxy. So it's essentially a sharpening tool, but to really maximize its effectiveness, you'll want to use layer masks in Photoshop. And all those are basically selecting the areas of the image you wish to adjust from the ones that you don't. So as I mentioned, where certain areas, in this case the pillars of creation, I sharpen them up much further than I would say the layer of just the stars themselves. I want the stars to remain soft. I want the pillars of creation to be sharp. So that's where the masks come in. And that black and white image you see there on the bottom is an example of what the masks look like. And you can tell it's masked the brightest areas of the image. The white area is where we're going to select, and the black is where we're going to leave alone. So in this case would be leaving that black area alone, perhaps performing some noise reduction to that area, and then sharpening the brighter areas. But you can really fine tune those masks. StarNet++, I briefly mentioned before, is extremely powerful here because it, of course, separates the stars from your image. So you can process them independently from one another, because usually you want to adjust those stars in a different way than you would want to adjust the structure of your nebula. Final slide here. I hope I haven't went too long and there's time for questions. This is something that's very exciting to me and how I've kind of committed to my astrophotography in the backyard. That is an observatory I recently put up. It was a long time coming. It is called the Black Dog Observatory, named after my faithful companion, Rudy, who is very proud to have that name. And yeah, so that's the latest from the Astro Backyard. And if you want to follow everything that I do, I share absolutely everything. You can follow along on the Astro Backyard YouTube channel and astrobackyard.com blog. So that's all I have, and hopefully there's some questions.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Fabulous presentation, great images, and it's really amazing the before and after images, the kind of detail that you can pull through processing. Really well done. Let's go to Emma for questions.
We've got a few questions for you. First question is from Super Creative. Is doing RGB stars worth it for an HOO or SHO image? And do you do it?
It is. Okay, I love that question because I know we have a more advanced crowd. Yes, it is always worth it to shoot RGB stars. I think so anyway. So the reason that question is so smart is because something I didn't mention, when you shoot using those narrow bandpass filters, you're essentially going to create an image with white stars. But if you shoot in broadband, that's where you'll collect the natural star colors. So what a lot of astrophotographers will do is shoot exposures in broadband RGB, often shorter exposures, just to get that layer of colored stars. And I think it's always worth it. Due to time constraints and cloudy skies, I would say I rarely get to it, but it's always worth it if you have the chance to capture the beautiful real star colors in your deep sky object.
Thank you. Lewis wants to know, do you do any post-production, so to speak, where the filter that you used did not give the shot you expected? And do you use any software other than Photoshop?
So yeah, in terms of post-production on the images, shooting with those multi-band pass or the narrowband filters, a lot of times, yeah, you will see an image that's almost close to what the final image will look like in a single exposure, but 80% of the time, it's just, it's absolutely buried in there. So there is some serious stretching going on. And when I say stretching, I mean that, areas of the midtones and the highlights come way up, the highlights not too much, and keeping those dark areas down. So if you think about the histogram and your data, you know that it's in there, but I'm doing some very strong S curves, if for those familiar with that, to actually bring that data way up. So all of my images are quite heavily processed for sure.
This question also comes in from Lewis. How often do you do unplanned photography?
Ooh, unplanned. Well, I guess if it's a surprise clear night, yeah. Oh, you know what? In the case of last year when we had Comet Neowise, to me it felt like it came up overnight in terms of its availability to photograph. And that's something I certainly didn't plan, months in ahead to photograph. And it was so exciting and so memorable to shoot something new like a comet. And yeah, so that was very unplanned. And stuff most recently, like the partial solar eclipse. Again, that was all these astronomical events are very reactionary because sometimes it's a very limited window of opportunity and you don't know if it's going to be cloudy or not. So most of my unplanned shots are astronomical events like that.
Thank you. Ward wants to know, if you don't have access to a mono camera, would putting a color DSL into mono mode to do filtered imaging work as well?
It wouldn't work as well, but you know, I've heard a lot of people say, you know, it's a waste of time to shoot narrowband with a color camera in general. I found that not to be the case, specifically with the hydrogen alpha. I think you can use a color camera to collect really impactful, dramatic hydrogen alpha details on a moonlit night with your DSLR camera or a color camera, and add those to an existing color project. As for converting a color camera to monochrome, I'm not sure of the entire process there, but I would think that you don't actually get that 4 times as strong signal as you would with a dedicated monochrome sensor.
Andy wants to know if you use Mac, PC, or Linux.
I use PC, and you know, unfortunately for some, I find that the astrophotography world, at least in terms of software, is more PC friendly. So I know a lot of creative professionals use you know, Mac computers. So it's unfortunate, and it is getting better. But for some of the tools, you have to come up with a workaround to use your Mac. But luckily for me, I've been a PC user from day one, and I'm too old to switch now.
This next question comes in from Alan. If there's one filter for astrophotography under the urban skies you would recommend, what would it be?
The two that come to mind, I mean, in this hobby, there's no one answer for anything, but the two that come to mind are the Optolong L Extreme and the Radian Triad Ultra. The L Extreme is much more affordable. And for if you like shooting emission nebulae and you have a color camera and you're under light polluted skies, you can confidently get that L Extreme filter and thank me later.
Lewis wants to know, do you license your photos to the Photoshop or PixInsight databases or others like National Geographic?
No, I don't. You know, it's something I've thought about and maybe will pursue in the future. But my images, other than being shared as a reveal at the end of one of my YouTube videos, don't really go many places. I don't, you know, I've submitted a few NASA APOD images and got the one, but I really don't do a whole lot with my images and don't license them. But it's worth looking into. I guess, you know, the real reason I don't is because I'm never truly satisfied with my final image, and it's not done yet. And I'm not ready to, you know, it has to be perfect before I go that far with an image. And, you know, maybe only 2 or 3 of my images have ever got to that stage.
You taught the Canadian Astrophotography School's program in 2019. Do you plan to teach this program again?
I don't plan to. I suppose if they asked again, I would consider it. It is a lot of fun to do a hands-on face-to-face workshop. It was, you know, unlike anything else, it was nice to be able to teach a class in person, but then be able to, you know, come up to individuals and help them through the issues they're having. Because, you know, when I'm doing these YouTube tutorials and explaining things, there's no feedback. So if I'm going too fast or not explaining something properly, I don't know until after it's over. So the live classes are really nice. So yeah, I would do it again.
Thank you. This is the last question coming in from Robert. How many subscribers do you have on your YouTube channel now?
Last I checked, it was 271,000. Yeah, the YouTube is such an interesting thing, and really what it comes down to is being consistent and being dedicated to it. I've been making videos for 5 years, and, you know, early on, very few people were watching, but I was just as excited to make them back then as I am now. So, so much fun. I can't believe how far it's come.
That's great. That's all of our questions. So back to you, Paul.
Trevor, before we let you go, I actually have a question of my own. When you're shooting a monochrome LRGB, what is your typical single exposure length?
Typical exposure length for my skies is about 180 seconds. I'll do 3 minutes in each color filter. And then the luminance will either be about the same or maybe even a little longer. But I kind of play it by ear. Depends on where the object is too. So because I have that great view to the north, for example, that the Whirlpool galaxy kind of hanging around Ursa Major and the Big Dipper, I could shoot those 3 minutes successfully because it was out of the light dome and kind of in a darker spot, but usually around 3 minutes.
Okay, good to know. Thank you very much.